Currently a PhD student at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, studying anthropology, which they make me say, but really I'm studying historical and conflict archaeology here on the Great Plains. Prior to that, I did my master's in public history at Colorado State University, mostly because I didn't want to get another real job, because I had one of those for 22 years as a United States Army officer, where I spent most of my time as a propagandist, a psychological operations officer on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you. I've always had a love for history, and thankfully technology is going to work, so you get to see some more cool pictures. And so tonight, can everybody hear me if I don't swallow the microphone? Okay. Usually not a problem for me. I guess that's the Army rubbing off. So tonight I'm going to talk about reflections on culture, conflict, and the comedy of Territorial, Colorado, and some tragedy thrown in there. And I'm going to really do that in 3 acts and kind of draw on the 3 things I mentioned. First, I'm going to talk about my dissertation research, which deals with the days after Colorado's darkest day, which I'll explain as we go through that. Then I'll talk a little bit about my master's research, which was the professor coming west. And you'll see in both of those how they relate to Territorial Colorado and how they relate really to our world today. And especially here for the professor coming west, how it relates to what at the time was Summit County, all of western Colorado. And then I'll close with tying it into my family tale, and really how I tie into have an interest in the history of Grand County, Routt County, and Moffat counties here in western Colorado. So if I asked everybody here that's from Colorado, grew up in Colorado, what the darkest day in Colorado's history was, I would fair to say a good number of you would raise your hand and say that it was the Sand Creek Massacre on the 29th of January, 1864. And so for my dissertation research, I'm not focusing on that, but I'm looking at what happened afterwards, because you never really hear about the aftermath of Sand Creek. What happened to the 500 survivors of the Sand Creek Massacre? What happened to the other Cheyenne, Arapaho that were in the area that came to their aid? What happened with their Lakota allies, more at the time known as the Sioux, the Ogallala, and the Brule, that came and joined them in a military campaign? It's really been forgotten. And so that's really what I started to dig into in my dissertation research. And what I found out is that this little known campaign that usually gets about 2 paragraphs in most history books of the Indian Wars, Julesburg was attacked, the Cheyenne and Arapaho and the Lakota went on the warpath after the Sand Creek Massacre and tried to kill every white person they see. That pretty much sums up what's been written in the last 200 years or 150 years since the Sand Creek Massacre on what happened in the immediate aftermath of the Sand Creek Massacre. But as I dug into it, what I found out is it's a fascinating time in our territorial history, in that the Cheyenne, the Arapaho link up with the Lakota and form an alliance and go on a military campaign that lasts throughout 1865, and we'll talk about that a little more as we go through. But during this period, not only do they go on the warpath, but they're successful. Wildly successful, challenging the U.S. military throughout Nebraska, Colorado, and Wyoming without really any impact for almost an entire year, until it comes to a draw in the fall of 1865 with General Connor's Powder River campaign, with thousands of post-Civil War troops are sent west, and then he has forces to confront them, but even that isn't successful. And so what I'm really looking at in my dissertation is kind of what's shown on the slide. All of those little arrows show what the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota did during January and February of 1865. And what they do is attack literally every single stage station, ranch on the South Platte and the Platte and North Platte rivers, from Fort Morgan, Colorado, nearly to Fort Kearney, Nebraska. And in most cases, with exception of 2 or 3, they burn and destroy every single one of those ranches and stage stations. The only forts that are not overrun are Fort McPherson, which is where North Platte is today, Camp Rankin, which becomes Fort Sedgwick at Julesburg. It is attacked and suffers significant losses. And then Fort Wicked and Valley Station, which survived during that attack by remarkable holding out of one family known as the Godfreys, and it becomes known as Fort Wicked, and that was a stage station and a ranch house that was located near what is today Moreno, Colorado, right on Highway 6 as it crosses the South Platte River. And so it was a really remarkable time. You think, wow, that's pretty impressive. They did all of that. But when I throw this map up there to kind of highlight at the start, they actually broke out into areas where they were familiar with. So the Cheyenne went further west because that was the area they knew best. The Arapaho went in the center. The Lakota more into Nebraska because they were more familiar with those areas. So they're literally having a military campaign that gets overshadowed. Even at Julesburg, when they're doing things, they're not simply killing white soldiers. Now, they're very happy to do that. For instance, there were two very unfortunate soldiers from the Sand Creek Massacre who definitely you could say justice was rendered to them. They had gotten back to Denver after the Sand Creek Massacre in January. They decide it's time to go back to the east, and so they take off in a wagon around January 7th, 8th, and start leaving Denver heading east. Well, with them, they actually have relics, quote unquote, as they called them, war trophies, including scalps from the Sand Creek Massacre. Why you would want to keep those things, even as an Army officer, I don't understand that part. But they did, and unbeknownst to them, they ran into members of the Cheyenne Dog Soldier Warrior Societies that actually could recognize whose hair that and scalp that was. Their bodies were never found. We know they left Valley Station, and they never made it to Julesburg. And that George Bent, the son of William Bent, who we'll talk about later, in some of his writings, wrote about how the Cheyenne had captured them and, let's just say, did very horrendous, unspeakable things, rightfully so, for retribution and what they had done at Sand Creek. But beyond that, they're actually doing very specific military things. So at Julesburg, they attack it twice, January 7th, 1865 to begin the war, and then again on 2nd of February, 1865. But on January 7th, they don't burn the stage station. The stage station is attacked because it's Walmart in 1865. It is the warehouses for the Overland Trail and the Mail Company. And so everything that goes out from Julesburg to Laramie and then all the way to Fort Bridger is stored there for supplies. Everything all the way down from Denver up to Laramie to Fort Bridger is stored there at these massive warehouses. So they attack and raid it because they want all the goods that are inside the warehouse, because they need those items to resupply the victims of the Sand Creek Massacre that survived. They literally walked away with only the clothing that they had in November of 1864 in the middle of a very harsh winter. And so they needed a lot of help and assistance. So they're doing a very military raid, going to get something and leaving, and not trying to overrun it. They're not trying to kill all the soldiers. They don't attack the fort because they know that would be very costly. They could have overrun it. They ended up having 1,500 soldiers against 40 that day, but they were doing things for very specific reasons because of what they needed to do. So I just kind of highlight that as we'll tell a few more of the stories as we go through. And it really goes back to how did we get there in the whole battle in Western history. A lot of crazy stories if you haven't heard them. It really starts for us, of course, how do we get Colorado in the West? Well, it's through Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. And what he does first is send out a guy named Zebulon Pike, shown there on the screen, to come to Colorado, and he comes up the Arkansas River in 1906, looking to try to figure out where Mexico is. He has some other rules. He's supposed to go out and figure out where Mexican forces are, Spanish forces, at this time. But Pike, though, is not necessarily the greatest military mind. He attempts to enter the San Cristo Mountains in the wintertime. Generally not a good idea. Some of his guys he leaves back on the plains, freezing to death. Eventually he makes it through the mountains, down into the San Luis Valley, where his little encampment that History Colorado has in the general area today. So he sends some guys back to go find his soldiers. And he gets there, and they're so bad off they can't walk, and they're dying and freezing and have frostbite and green. They actually send their toes back to Pike as a plea not to leave them, to say that they can't survive. Fortunately, he gets them back. He does save them. He gets them to the stockade that they've built. And they probably all would have died in the wintertime, except the Spanish found out they were there through their Native American allies, at the time Spanish allies, the indigenous populations, and the Spanish sent a military force up and captured them, took them to Santa Fe, eventually shipped them down further to the Spanish capital at the time. But the bungling continues going forth. Next comes, of course, another important time for us. and really highlight why this links in. Of course, the Spanish and the Mexican independence happens, and by 1920, the West is no longer part of Spain. West of the Continental Divide, it is now Mexico. They are not as antagonistic to the United States, and so they just open up trade opportunities. And the first guy that comes out and tries to map that, and we all see the peak once you go over Rabbit Ears on a sunny day, sometimes you can see it, is Stephen Long comes out to explore the West in 1920. He comes down the Platte River, just like many an explorer after him will. And then coming up the Arkansas shortly afterwards, as this country is quote-unquote beginning to open up to the United States, William Bent comes out initially as a fur trader working for other people and realizes that he can make quite a bit of money starting his own business, which he then starts to do in the late 1920s, breaking off from the other American fur companies. And he builds Bent's Fort down on the Arkansas. And it's a very pivotal event. 18, I'm sorry.
Not 19.
I know, I can't believe it. It's 2 centuries already. Even I turned 50 next month. This month I can't handle it. I'm starting to lose my mind. But thank you. And if there are any questions, please ask questions too as well during this. So Bent comes out and he opens up Bent's Fort. But what that does is it starts pulling the Cheyenne further south. They're already being pushed south by the Lakota out of the Black Hills in the early 1800s. And by the 1840s, they've come down to Bent's new fort, especially the Southern Cheyenne Black Kettles bands and others that are massacred at Sand Creek, and they start trading with Bent. Bent, here on the is an 1848 drawing of a sun dance that's occurring in the center of Bent's Fort. Bent actually marries 2 Cheyenne sisters sequentially. One dies, and then he marries the next sister, and she helps take care of the children. They have additional children. And he has a son that's showing on there, George Bent, who therefore is half Cheyenne, half American, and grows up at Bent's old fort, and then eventually part of the time at Bent's new fort, which Bent builds after the Army takes over his old fort during the Mexican-American War. And so George Bent spent a lot of time with his mother's family in a teepees or lodges, which would be the more preferable term, as those shown here. This is actually, I always show this anytime I can because it's an 18, I am saying that one correct, 53 photograph of the Timbers region just east of Bent's new fort on the Arkansas River, where the Cheyenne and Arapaho used to do a lot of their wintering. That photo was taken by a photographer that was with Fremont when he came back on one of his last expeditions through Colorado, trying to do a railroad survey in 1853. A gentleman named Carvalho was with him, took a lot of photographs. There are only, I believe, 2 photographs in his entire expedition that survived, and somehow one of them was the first photograph ever taken in Colorado in 1853 on the Big Timbers with George Bent's relatives. Bent plays a fascinating role in this story that I'm researching for my dissertation. Does anybody know who Casper, Wyoming is named after? I had no idea either until I started my dissertation work. Casper, Wyoming is actually named after Caspar Collins. His name had a in it at the end instead of an E, but there was another post office with Casper already. It confused the post office, so they changed the spelling to make sure it got to the right place. This is really before zip codes and things like that. And so that Caspar Collins was a lieutenant in the 11th Ohio Cavalry and was killed in 1865 towards the end of the response to the Sand Creek Massacre at the Battle of Platte River Bridge in Casper, Wyoming, which grew up around him and was named after him because he was killed by the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota in that early battle in 1865 at the early beginnings of the Indian War. Later becomes Red Cloud's War a few years later along the Bozeman Trail, and then of course culminates in the Battle of Little Bighorn. Bent's fascinating because he actually happened to be at Sand Creek as well. George Bent had to be one of the luckiest individuals on the planet. He's in all types of battles throughout his lifetime. So in the 1850s, his dad sends him off to Kansas City, to Westport to be schooled. He's starting to get schooled there. The Civil War breaks out. He's about 18. He joins the Confederacy and is fighting with the Confederacy in Missouri in a couple of significant battles, Wilson's Creek, and then ends up at Corinth and a number of other battles, and is actually captured finally and taken prisoner. Somebody recognizes him and is like, hey, you're Colonel Bent's son. If you go home, say you won't fight the Union anymore, we'll let you go. And so he's like, all right, that sounds a lot better than prison camp. Takes off, goes back to his family. He's hanging out at Sand Creek on the reservation lands in 1864, and is actually at Sand Creek when the massacre takes place. He's shot at, slightly injured, is taken prisoner. They want to execute him, but again, some people recognize who he is and decide that's probably not an advisable course of action for the Colorado Cavalry to do that to Colonel Bent's son. So he, his half-brother, are taken prisoner, go back, eventually are released, and now he's pretty angry. His half-brother is so angry, he actually tries to kill his father. Had nothing to do with Sand Creek, but is so angry against the Anglo-Americans, the whites, he actually tries to kill William Bent a few years later on the family ranch. George doesn't have the hostility to his father, but does go and join the warrior societies and fights with them throughout 1865 and a little bit into 1866. It's fascinating, though, for George Bent, is later in life he writes a number of history books co-authored with some historian and anthropologists, because being a half American, half Native American, he captured, as we would in American history, and was able to tell that Native American's perspective that normally you're unable to get in a lot of these 1800s, 19th century conflicts. Another kind of weird, strange turn that relates back to Sand Creek, kind of comes out of that, is why is Fort Sedgwick that I researched named that? Why is how that relates all back to the Civil War as well? Well, it all relates back kind of to the start of the Gold Rush, which comes on the tails of Colonel Edwin Voss Sumner, a very distant, I find out, cousin of mine, and Major John Sedgwick, who was deputy. In 1857, they come tromping across the plains. They want to put the Cheyenne in check. They think they've been out of control, so they're coming in to push them around. They don't find them in Colorado, but they chase them out into Kansas. They actually have a battle at Solomon Forks, it's called, with the Cheyenne and Arapaho. The Cheyenne had convinced, one of their medicine men had convinced them that he had a special power to stop bullets from hurting them. And so the Cheyenne go through all these ceremonies, they get in line, they're going to stand and face the cavalry of Colonel Sumner's, of Bull Sumner, later becomes a two-star general in the Civil War, as does Major General Sedgwick, who's killed in 1864 during the Civil War. Except the only problem with that is Sumner is an old cavalryman. So he's like, hey, for whatever reason that day, he decided to do a cavalry charge. So at Solomon Forks, they literally decide to do a cavalry charge. The Cheyenne are in line, and here comes the dragoons in formation, sabers drawn, and of course the Cheyenne in their minds don't have medicine for sabers, wisely break ranks and run away from the field of battle, and very few casualties on the other side. I guess that's just one of those fates of history, one of the rare cavalry charges in the West, especially against the Native Americans, that you had to do by choice. Another interesting, strange fate of history. Everybody know where Fort Lyons is today. It used to be Bent's new fort, then it got moved to where the Sanitarium and a lot of other, I believe now it's a work with homeless rehabilitation, people that are need some assistance with that, still being utilized for helping Coloradans. Well, it starts out in its original location in 1860 as Fort Weiss, named after a governor of Virginia, who later becomes a member of the Confederacy, so quickly becomes changed to Fort Lyons, which is named after the first general officer that was killed in the Civil War. Lo and behold, guess who it's founded by? I'm not sure if anybody recognizes the photograph, but one of the gentlemen that was there as an officer to found it in the Union Army was one very own Jeb Stuart, who obviously goes on to notoriety and infamy, but just another one of those strange facts and twists of history in the early days of the state or territory. Another kind of crazy story I've come across in my research. Has anybody ever gone up Highway 287 going to Laramie out of Fort Collins and seen Virginia Dell, or maybe even visited the Virginia Dell stage station? It is the only stage station building left in Colorado from the Overland stage. All the others were long torn down, used for other things. But it was founded by a gentleman named Jack Slade. He named it Virginia, was his wife. Dell is a creek that runs by there. And so that's how it got its name. He built it in 1862. And so on the slide is a picture that William Henry Jackson, noted photographer with a lot of the early Western surveys, took some of the early photographs of Yellowstone National Park with the Hayden surveys that helped make Yellowstone into a national park. He went out and also visited a lot of these along the Overland Trail as he was doing work and did some paintings. The Upper California Crossing is what became Julesburg Stage Station. But he helped capture and propagate a tale of Jack Slade, who built Virginia Dell. Slade was basically, to put it, a dirtbag by no other means. And his story was mostly made popular, telling this story by Mark Twain, who stopped at Julesburg and wrote a book about it called Roughing It, His Travels Across the West, to go meet his brother, who was, I believe, the Territorial Secretary in Nevada at the time. And he published this book in the 1880s, but in the 1860s, when he made this trip, he ran into Slade, who at the time was the supervisor for the Overland Trail that we were talking about. So he's like the district manager that oversaw both of those sections. And Slade and the founder of Julesburg, who Julesburg is named after, Jules Benai, who was another dirtbag, we believe French trader who was unscrupulous, would steal all the horses from the stage station, sell them to the Native Americans, go capture them, get rewarded for it in a nice little circle. Slade wasn't really upset about that. He was probably just upset he wasn't getting his cut, would probably be the guess. But anyways, they get into a lot of heated arguments. And eventually in April of 1860, Jules Benai shoots Slade 5 or 6 times in a saloon in Julesburg. And believes Slade is dead. His guys try to hang Benai. The rope breaks. He's married to a Native American woman. His friends in the tribe help him get away. Slade recovers remarkably for that time period and swears that he will kill Jules Benai. Sometime within the next year, Benai is no longer hanging out around Julesburg. He has another ranch up towards Fort Laramie. Slade's guys actually find Benai and realize it's him and call Slade. Slade is sworn that he's going to kill Benai. And so what's shown in the upper picture is Benai showing up, pumping Jules full of lead as he's tied to the fence post and killing him. And then proceeding, legend goes, to cut off his ears. One he staked to the fence post to let everybody else know what he had done, and then reportedly kept the other as a watch fob for the rest of his life. Fortunately, he didn't have to worry about a lot of the flesh rotting away, because by 1864, Jack Slade is hung by a lynch mob in Montana for continuing to be a dirtbag and getting in a lot of gambling fights in Montana during the gold rush. So there is a little karma in the West. One slide, I swore I wouldn't show a lot of history slides and talk on here, but there are some other fateful things that came out that I do always think are important when I give talks to highlight. So they realized before the Sand Creek Massacre that the Overland Trail was getting disrupted. There had been a number of times throughout 1864 where the mail had been stopped, the telegraph was getting cut. So DC, General Halleck, who's the chief of staff at the time, orders General Connor, who's the district commander in Utah, to take over the Overland Trail. From Fort Kearney to Utah, he's going to be in charge. He comes out with 2 cavalry troops. They can't get out west. They can't get over the South Pass or Bridger Pass because of the snow. And so he comes forward on the stagecoach with Holiday that owns the stagecoach and arrives in Denver in late October 1864 and is taking a survey of what is there. And he sends back an email. Again, I'm stuck on my generations. Sends back a telegram to Washington, D.C. So this is about a year after the telegraph arrives in Denver. It gets there in late 1863. And sends back this telegram extract that's on there. And basically, as you read it, if you can see that up there, what he says is, I don't have enough forces. Nobody will give me forces. They really don't have them to give. So there's no reason we should go out and rile up the Indians in 1864. We need to wait, build supplies. We need to get ammunition. We need to get command and control in place. And then if they're still acting up in 1865 in the spring, when we have enough forces in hand, we can have a campaign against them if we need to. And then he's like, I do not deem it wise or prudent either to undertake or advise a campaign against them because of the reason I've expressed. He writes that and telegraphs it off to General Halleck on the 21st of November, 1864. 8 days later, Colonel Shivington, the district commander of Colorado, who sees that he's about to lose the Overland Trail, he's already lost the Santa Fe Trail from his district. They're going to be under two separate commanders. He wants to be a general. He does exactly what General Connor said not to do, and the result is exactly what General Connor said would happen. You unleash what really becomes the next decade of the Indian War on the plains, starting at Julesburg and culminating with the same Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota at the Battle of Little Bighorn on January 25th, 1876, 11 years later. The other thing I like to highlight, because I find that the organization is fascinating, and we don't spend a lot of time when we talk Western history, a lot of times trying to understand the Native Americans, the indigenous tribes. And so if you look at the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota and how they're organized, this is kind of what I've been trying to recreate, who would have been at the Battle of Julesburg, because even within the tribes, there's not a lot of history. And so in doing that, I put together the different bands and trying to piece that back together, talking to a lot of Native Americans as well as ethnographers. But the fascinating part for me is the Cheyenne that's which would be on your right side of the slide. They actually had a 10-band system where each band had 4 members that were selected for 10 years to their council of 44. And that council decided when the tribe went to war, decided all major decisions. And then they would give guidance to the Cheyenne warrior societies. So actually in the 1865s, the Cheyenne had a civil military control, much like we have in the United States government through our own Constitution, with an elected leader being the commander-in-chief, the generals being told what to do by the elected officials. Another atrocity of what Shivington does in his brilliance, not only the moral, ethical, and military failures, one of the huge military failures is, by the attack at Sand Creek, Shivington destroys the leadership of 3 bands of the Southern Cheyenne that are in that Council of 44, rendering it ineffective, and then provides no civilian restraint to the warrior societies, which then unleashes the next 3 years of war in Colorado with the Cheyenne and the Arapaho primarily, that culminates at Summit Springs in July of 1869. The last thing I like to have to deal with in my dissertation, while I close out Act 1, is the legacy of one of the largest movie stars in the world, Kevin Costner. Has anybody in the room heard of a movie called Dances with Wolves? Well, Dances with Wolves, if you recall, Kevin comes trotting across the plains with his orders by himself. Not really sure why that would happen, but ends up at Fort Sedgwick, Colorado as his, well, they really don't say Colorado, but ends up at Fort Sedgwick as his post. The only problem with that is the story Kevin Costner is telling in Dances with Wolves is actually based on the tribes that are now in the 1860s, would have been in Oklahoma, and the movie was filmed in South Dakota. But if you have millions of dollars, you can film your movie wherever you want. It is an amazing film. It is also one of the first films that really presented Native Americans in a much more accurate light, involved them in the production with that. And so that's one of my challenges. That's kind of how Kevin Costner depicted Fort Sedgwick when he got there after the post closed down. The only problem with that is that Fort Sedgwick itself is a standard military fort that existed from 1865 to 71 and housed thousands of soldiers. Had upward of 65 buildings at its largest point. And then when it was Camp Rankin in 1865, it looked a little closer to what you saw in Kevin Costner's movie. But really it started out as a ranch house a few years ago before that. And so again, the challenges of competing history with Hollywood don't necessarily always match up. For Act 2, I wanted to kind of change, and what Fort Sedgwick is important in that time period is because it's about the trails. It's about the Overland Trail, the Mormon Trail, the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Pony Express that all follow the Platte Rivers up and down to get people to Denver, to Salt Lake, to California, to Oregon. That's what all these people are moving up and down. And then you also, as I mentioned, early explorers like Long and Pike that are following rivers down. And John Wesley Powell comes to Colorado for the first time in 1867 and is really one of the last explorers ever to follow the South Platte River down into Colorado at the time. Because slightly after he arrives in Denver in 1867, the Transcontinental Railroad is chugging its way across Nebraska and Wyoming, and by 1868, when he comes back a second time, he'll actually come to Cheyenne, Wyoming on the Transcontinental Railroad and then take wagons and stagecoaches down to Denver for his explorations. So John Wesley Powell ties into my research, and why I got involved with that is because of a family connection. And so John Wesley Powell shows up in Denver. He meets William Byers, who was the founder of the Rocky Mountain News, and as we'll talk, is also the founder of Hot Sulphur Springs. Byers came to Colorado in 1859 down that exact same route that we were talking about. That picture of the gold rush starting, that was one of the books Byers wrote in 1859 when he was in Omaha. He'd never been to Colorado, but he wrote a guidebook and sold it to people, telling them they should come here. If anyone would like to buy a book, I'll write about whatever you want if you want to get a similar deal. It's a pretty good gig, but Byers was a promoter of Colorado. But when he comes to Colorado, he comes with, brings the press with 4 of the quarter horses from his father-in-law's farm and 3 of his brother-in-laws. And 3 of those brothers were the brothers of Jack Sumner, who's my second great-grandfather. And so they bring the press for the Rocky Mountain News out in 1859, print the first paper, of course, in April 23rd, 1859. And I believe it was 2 days ago was the 149th and almost 10 months before the Post closed it in 2009. But Byers had this interest of making Hot Sulphur Springs what Steamboat is today. That was always his dream, to make it a kind of resort town and have people come there. It was a dismal failure. One tiny spring there, no offense to the current owners. But obviously not the mecca of a metropolis that he had desired that Winter Park or the other resorts have grown up around it. But he always tried. And so when he first got out of the Civil War, Jack Sumner goes up there and hangs out at the Hot Sulphur Springs. That is the little cabin. You can see both those are the same photographs. Those are Jack's original cabins that he built in 1866, 1867, and he would live up there with the Utes. Well, Jack had a lot of interaction with the Utes, which were foretelling perhaps of things to come just to the west of us, a few hundred miles, 100 miles or so, near Meeker. For one example, he went out one day and was trying to go up, we believe to go across one of the passes to come down to Denver, as he told the story later in life. And he gets shot by Grand Lake by 2 Utes, shoot at him and hit him in the arm with an arrow out of nowhere. Which he didn't know why. He was just on his horse. He makes his way back, injured, over near Westcott's cabin at Grand Lake. Eventually heals up, makes his way back to the trading post. When Chief Douglas, Otero, and the rest of the Northern Ute bands show up on the warpath and want to know why he had shot the 2 Indians that he had killed in response. And so they want him to come outside of the trading post. Well, Jack understands what's going to happen if he goes outside of the trading post. It would have been the end of Jack. I would not have been born, because he would have been killed pretty quickly if he was lucky. So he decides that's a pretty bad idea. So through sign language and the broken Ute he spoke, the broken English a few of them spoke, he stuck his revolver in the black powder that he normally sold to the Northern Utes and started to try to explain to them what had happened. Eventually, the Chief, Douglas and Otero, realize that something's going on, have some conversations with their guys, and they decide that they should probably fess up at this point, and they admit that they just kind of shot him out of nowhere and he hadn't really done anything. So at that point, from that point ever on, he seemed to generally get along with the Utes, spent most of his life living and working in Ute territory throughout Utah as well as Colorado, and actually died in 1907 in Fort Deschenes, which became the Uinta and Ouray Reservation. He also took around Bayard Taylor. Has anybody heard who Bayard Taylor is? Does anybody know that name? I never did before I got into this research either. So apparently in the 1860s, we actually had travel bloggers. We just didn't know about it. We thought it was a new thing that happened in the more modern era when we got Facebook and the internet and everything like that. But Bayard Taylor, starting in the 1840s, would convince people to fund him to go travel around the world. And he went on sailing trips all the way to Japan, visited Russia, visited Europe. He'd write newspaper articles, send them back ahead of time. He'd get back and then publish them into books and sell them to fund future travel. And he was based out of the Philadelphia area. So he actually comes to Colorado in 1867 and buyers Jack Sumner, William Russell Thomas, who was an editor for the news, take him around and do a bunch of tours with him and bring him around. But another fascinating thing, bring him all the way up to the hot sulfur springs, but apparently they didn't plan ahead and bring a boat. It was in the summertime. There was runoff before the Big Thompson sent all the water to Denver. And they couldn't actually cross and visit the hot sulfur springs, which was a rather regular occurrence, it appears. But then in 1867, Powell comes up, meets Jack. They decide that they should go down and explore more the next year. Powell comes back with a larger group of people to do some exploring in 1868. And in August of 1868, they make the first descent up to Long's Peak. They actually start from the west side, come up from Grand Lake, try to find a western route and realize that's not an accessible way to get up Long's Peak, and actually have to wrap around and basically come up and find a very similar route to what is the keyhole route that most people hike from the eastern side of Long's Peak today. And mostly are noted for being, quote unquote, the first Euro-Americans. From what most Native Americans thought of them at the time, were probably the first people to go up there because the Utes and the Arapaho that were around really couldn't figure out why in the world you would want to go up there, because it is a generally pretty miserable place to be. They actually got up there on a Sunday. They had to summit on a Sunday, had a little ceremony. Major Powell wasn't too happy because they were spending most of their time trying to drink a bottle of wine, and he thought that was a bad thing to do. Probably not a big fan of History Happy Hour. But anyways, they did summit those, and I always like to throw the pictures again from William Henry Jackson of Long's Peak in the drawing from the Hayden survey in the 1869, so they're not lost to the archives at Denver and DC. Another fascinating thing they do in 1868 is Powell, while everybody else is actually moving westward here to go to their winter quarters, which becomes Meeker, Colorado, which is originally founded on what is Powell Bottoms, and we'll talk that again in a moment. They actually summit what becomes Mount Powell. He does that with a couple gentlemen. They sign their name on that ledger that's torn up in the center, and they bury that can on top of Mount Powell. Ferdinand Hayden, when he comes out in 1874 and surveys this part of Colorado, he actually summits Mount Powell, names it Mount Powell, and signs his name on that actual same sheet of paper. I've seen it. It's in History Colorado. The Colorado Alpine Club found it in the early 20th century and saved it, buried in a soup can on top of Mount Powell. And so now it's actually in the archives at History Colorado being preserved. The can they buried in the signature block on Long's Peak has never been found. If I can get a permit from the Park Service one day to let me go metal detect on that unhospitable spot, I hopefully will try to see if we can locate that someday. So I threw this also on here because I always do this pitch because I'm still searching for this. When they left Colorado, they left Grant County, kind of came over what we believe to be Gore Pass, and came up this way through the valley, would have come right down now through the Yampa, following it to go west. They were headed to what was known as the Painted Cliffs. And the problem is that we have absolutely no idea where the Painted Cliffs were. And so we're still in a search for that and have yet to be able to find them. A lot of speculation that it may have been the ones out to the west where the interstate went through, where a lot of those cliffs were. I'd love to talk to you afterwards if there's a local knowledge of what that is. I've failed for 6 years, and many people before me, to locate that, to give us more of a guide point of their exact route that they were migrating their way westward throughout 1868. And they're doing that because they're going to get to the Powell Bottoms, where they're going to winter over 1868. And so in 1868, they set up cabins. That is an actual photograph of the last remaining of the two cabins two of the cabins they built for the winter of 1868 that's in the White River Museum in Meeker. It was taken in the early 20th century. And when they get there, a little foreshadowing to history, Powell breaks out his sextant, his surveying equipment, and he's trying to figure out the height of the mountains around him. Well, the Utes and Douglas and Colorado were there at this time period, friendly with Powell, friendly with Jack still, but were not really enamored by the idea of surveying equipment, because to them, surveying equipment meant one and only thing: here comes the whites to take my land. So they were thinking about whether or not they should string up Powell. Jack was able to have a conversation with them and actually convince them that no, Powell was weird and just actually wanted to know how tall the mountain was. They didn't understand why you needed to know that, but they decided that they should not string him up. Unfortunately, good old Nathan Meeker did not take that similar advice. So when Nathan Meeker becomes the Indian agent for the Northern Ute Reservation, which is at Powell Bottoms, at where they had camped in 1868, the same camping grounds with Chief Douglas and Colwell, does not take that same advice and tries to tear up their racetrack. They do not have the same reaction, and of course, Nathan Meeker and the other men at the agency are killed. The Utes have their conflict with the military that was coming down from Fort Steele to see what was going on, and from Fort D.A. Russell in Cheyenne, now what is F.E. Warren Air Force Base. And they had this conflict at that time period, and of course Meeker is killed, and the result of the Meeker Massacre, as it was called at the time, and of the Battle of Milk Creek, is that the Utes must go. And of course Bayard is heavily involved with that, others that are coveting the land that is here in western Colorado, and they are successful in their campaign, which is why the Northern Ute tribes are sent to Utah, to the Uinta and Ouray Reservation in the late 1870s, and by 1883 are completely out of Colorado and do not have a reservation in their homeland, as do the Southern Utes and the Ute Mountain Utes. It was all because of how Nathan Meeker responded and how events turned out in that period versus how Powell did a decade prior. I also like to highlight one other thing, because we're all standing here in Colorado. We often hear about John Wesley Powell and exploring the West and going down the rivers. Don't want to take anything away from that, but it was not just a Powell expedition. Don't say that just because obviously I have a relative who was his lead boatman going down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyons. But through the researches, we started to build back and analyze who was there and look at the people that went on the expedition down the Colorado River. There were only two people that came with Powell from Illinois to go down the Colorado River, and that was Major John Wesley Powell and his batshit crazy brother Walter, who they believe not only had PTSD from being a Civil War prisoner for about a year. Walter was so crazy during the Civil War that the Confederates actually took him out of the normal prison and put him in a special place because he was so crazy and disruptive to normal prison operations. They also think that somewhere after the war he got syphilis, and so on top of his PTSD and other issues, he actually had syphilis and was going through those issues, making him even more unstable, to the point later in life Walter Powell actually has to be committed by Major Powell and his brother-in-law to a military, basically insane asylum, sanitarium back in Washington, D.C., because they've just gotten too old to actually take care of him and to handle him. But I always like to handle that 50% of the expedition that goes down the Colorado River was from here in Colorado. That's why they got involved, because they either had ties to Jack, living here in Hot Sulphur Springs on the west slope, or because they were tied to William Byers, his brother-in-law. Ormel Howland was his printer, and Seneca Howland was Ormel's brother while they went down. And the other three they actually picked up in Wyoming as they were getting ready to go down from Green River. Wyoming, they meet these guys at Green River and at Fort Bridger. You always see fascinating photographs from the Union Pacific of the great scenery of Green River in 1869, but the scenery was the only thing there. It actually was not even a Union stop when they started to go down the river. It looked like it does in this picture from 1871. The Union Pacific had moved west moved their water point so the train didn't even stop there. There literally was one bar where they were at. While they sat at that bar, foretelling things to come, they literally drank every amount of alcohol in Green River, Wyoming, while they waited 2 months for Major Powell to return with boats. They couldn't make alcohol quick enough for the 8 of them to drink. Not sure who was paying that bill. Glad I wasn't. But it was a pretty desolate place, and so they set off from Green River to go down the rivers. Won't spend a lot of time talking river history, but of course, this on the Swanning Gorge in 1871, 2 years on the second Powell expedition after the first, and of course on the left is what that looks like today under Fleming Gorge Reservoir. Quite a difference. They also go down in a lot of the places we think of here in Colorado. Has anybody been to Dinosaur National Park? So some of the first, at least organized expeditions through Dinosaur are in May and June of 1869 with the Powell expeditions. They named the gates of Lodore. They put that name there when they entered it coming down the river in 1869. A little apropos as the events start to get a little more choppy after they enter what is now Dinosaur National Park. So kind of some of those turbulence and funny tales of history. Has anybody heard of Disaster Falls in Dinosaur National Park on the Green River? Well, Dinosaur Falls is named because of the Powell expedition. They had 4 boats. The Emma Dean was what Powell was in, named after his wife with Jack and Dunn. And then 3, it was a smaller scout boat, and they had 3 larger boats that are about 21-foot white hulls, designed basically to go out to larger boats on the Great Lakes. Powell bought the boats in Chicago, so that's what he got. He did not get boats to run rapids with. So they're going down. The lead boat, the scout boat, would kind of look where to go and give signals. And when they get going down inside, just past the gates of Lodore, they come to this set of rapids, and they normally would pull over, scout the rapids from the shore, decide how they were going to do things. A lot of times they were very tentative. They would unload all the gear. They would, from the side, try to rope the boat down, or if they had to, carry it over land. I can't imagine carrying a 2,000-pound pine boat or oak boat across rocks inside of Dinosaur National Park. But at this point, one of the boats didn't see the signal, and so it actually goes down across the rapids backwards and smashes into a rock, breaks the boat in half. 3 guys go flying out of it. Of course, ironically, they're in the boat known as No Name because they never named the boat. Well, it's a good thing they didn't, because it only lasted about 18 days before they broke it. And so the boat breaks apart. The 3 guys are saved. They get them to shore, and then they realize, oh crap, 2 things happened. One, Ormel Halland had actually taken all of the notes for the trip that day and had them in his coat pocket. And so when he went in the water, they were all ruined, washed out. So they had no more notes. Normally they took notes, made duplicates or triplicates, and gave them to different people on different boats to cross-level in case something happened. The one time they don't, boat breaks. They also put all of the scientific equipment in a hurry that morning inside of the same boat. And it happened to be the No Name, which now was sinking in the rapids out there. Jack notices that one of the halves of the boat is wedged across the rock, so he decides to take the scout boat out, goes out by himself, is able to manage to get over to this boat, gets in the water in this little eddy area, and is able to pull out the scientific equipment. All of a sudden, Powell's watching this from the shore, and the men start cheering, and Powell's like, oh my land, I was so excited in his journal. The men were so excited that we could continue our mission because they don't have the scientific equipment. They can't have map readings. They don't know latitude, longitude. They can't do anything. Game's over until they get new equipment from the east. Again, 1869, not just travel. You're probably going to order that stuff from London, some of it from Europe. By the time it gets here, you're a couple of years later. But then Powell writes, then I realized they weren't yelling about the scientific equipment. They were yelling because Jack had found the last half keg of whiskey that Ormel Halland also had with the equipment in the front of the boat. So not only did they drink all of the whiskey out of Green River, they very rapidly had exhausted the whiskey they had brought with them throughout that. Also inside of the Dinosaur National Park, south of the gates of Lodore, a couple other fascinating or entertaining stories. Powell had a knack for going places he shouldn't. Later in life, Jack had some controversies he started over Powell's leadership, and a lot of that I think is just old age and probably uranium poisoning that made him crazy. Powell was clearly a remarkable man. He lost an arm, his right arm. He was right-handed to begin with. Lost his arm in the Battle of Shiloh. Was an artilleryman and got injured. So he's doing all of this with one arm. I've gone down on a 32-foot and an 18-foot raft through the Grand Canyon. That's nerve-wracking enough through some of those rapids, even without the water that they would have had back in 1869. So to do any of this with one arm is amazing. But he would always go walking and looking around and trying to climb up places with one arm, and then he would get stuck. And then somebody would have to come, take their pants off, hold him down so Powell could jump and grab on with one arm, and they could pull him up. Because if you ever try to rock climb with one arm, I don't advise it, but you can't actually turn around or do anything without basically breaking your wrist or falling off the wall. And so Powell repeatedly had to do that throughout the trips. One of them was reportedly in his book very close to what is Echo Canyon, Echo Park, down inside of Dinosaur right as it comes in to the southern part of the Dinosaur National Park. The other exciting fact they found out during this time period, has anyone ever eaten potato greens? I don't advise it because apparently they're toxic. They will give you violent diarrhea and violent vomiting very, very quickly. So as they're coming down, they've run out of most of what they had from Green River for fresh vegetables and fruits and things. They just have salt tack, they have some apples, coffee, other meat that's been preserved. So they're like, oh, look at this, an Indian garden that we can take and somebody's left. And they go and they think that they're these greens and they don't know better, and so they actually take them, cook them up, and then find out that they're very, very toxic. They also find out about fire and to control your campfire and not build it on a sandbar with a lot of dry reefs. They lose about half their cooking gear while they're coming through Dinosaur National Park because they have a fire. They go out searching around, the cook's back in camp, and they come back to see him pushing the boats into the water, diving into the boats as the campsite, some of their tents and some of their equipment burn up. So again, most of them, outside of Jack and a couple of the guys that spent time in Hot Sulphur Springs, were not your most noted Westerners. In fact, one of the gentlemen that was in Disaster Falls, Frank Goodman, has enough after Disaster Falls, leaves when they get to the Uinta Trading Post a few days later and says, thank you, I've had enough fun, I'll just live in Brown Parks for the rest of my life. Kind of turning to Act 3 to wrap kind of up in the history and talking about some more of how it relates to that. As I said, as Jack was going down the Colorado River in 1869, Byers and a couple of his brothers were executing their plan to acquire legal title to the Hot Sulphur Springs. And so in the early 1860s, Byers had come up to Hot Sulphur Springs right around the time Berthoud had come up, had seen the springs and wanted to take control of it, to have it to make his winter wonderland resort and his summer resort so he could send people up here and make money. And he was going to do that. So his plan initially, Jack worked at the Hot Sulphur Springs. Has anybody been to Cousins Ranch near Winter Park? That's a part of the Grant County Historical Society. That ranch was originally the Twin Haystacks Ranch. And it's at basically where you would come across Rollins Pass and come down, and where the pass over Berthoud, the two roads would meet. And there was a little station there where people could rest overnight to the next day to continue your trip on up to Hot Sulphur Springs. So it was a whole little family business, how to make the most money out of everybody that buyers could con in or send up here to go to the Hot Sulphur Springs. So in 1869, they actually acquire and go down to Fairplay to file the paperwork to register the Hot Sulphur Springs with them. That's a letter actually that was written at the time back to his sister, one of the Sumner brothers, to their sister, telling them what was going on. And it is Women's History Month, so I'll talk about Marietta Sheriff really briefly as well. Byers, of course, acquires that, and then in 1870s lays out the town of Hot Sulphur Springs. He and William Sumner, Jack's younger brother, actually plat the city. If you ever go look at the actual plat they have on display in the museum or the county courthouse, miraculously not platted as part of Hot Sulphur Springs is the land of the west of the river, which Byard acquired that he's referencing in this letter. And again, this whole idea is turning it into a resort and getting people to move up there and settle. Of course, in 1874, he convinces someone to come settle in Hot Sulphur Springs. One of the first people to come across the Rollins Pass wagon road, James H. Crawford, has a little ties, I believe, to the town we're in here tonight. Obviously, one of the original founders of settlements in the area, coming out here in 1874, settling for the first year in Hot Sulphur Springs, buying some of that land that Byers was settling. That's William Sumner that I mentioned that helped town plat that. So the family connection is there through Crawford, but Crawford also would have had a lot of interaction not only with Byers and William Sumner from my family, but also likely with Jack Sumner as well. Jack Sumner, after he went down the Colorado River, had no intent of going back with Powell, decided that wasn't a good idea, and miraculously got snowed in and didn't make it back to go down the 1871-1872 Powell expedition. But he did decide that he didn't like Denver, and he kept moving further and further west of Denver to get away from the civilized lands. Started out near Union Colony, what is now Greeley, where his first son was born in 1874. And then in 1876, he moves up to Hans Peak and is working as gold mining up there. He played a lot with hydraulic mining, so you can probably blame him for a lot of the scarring in the lands up there. Hopefully tonight in a few beers will atone for some of that. But also because it is Women's History Month, I decided to throw this one in. Has anybody ever gone past Hot Sulphur Springs, and as you go out of town, seen the signs on the right there, on the bottom right, for the Sheriff Ranch? It's right as you go through across the river, the Colorado River, headed towards Granby. And you'll see the sign there for the Sheriff Ranch. That's for Marietta Sheriff, who that letter was written to. She was the oldest Sumner daughter. She actually moves to Colorado in the mid-1870s. Her husband had come out in the gold rush and went back to Illinois, died 2 years later, leaving her with those 3 young boys. And so she eventually follows the rest of the family out west here to Colorado. And in 1879, decides that she's going to move up to Grand County. And by 1881 has established the Sheriff's Ranch just east of Hot Sulphur Springs. And her descendants still own that ranch today, Ida Sheriff, that's in that area. So I do like to highlight that because it's amazing. Elizabeth Byers also spent a great deal of time, as did Crawford's wife, here in the west of the Continental Divide. And we usually think of this, especially in the 1860s, 1870s, very little that women were out here in this part. We always think of the battles and such as that. And even Powell, when he came out, brought his wife with him. Emma Dean Powell was a remarkable woman, a little crazy at the end of life. She burned all of Powell's papers when he died that she had at the house because she was mad he got fired from the USGS a few years prior. But she was the third woman to summit Long's Peak, not Long's Peak, Pikes Peak in 1867. And she, in 1867, also when she came up, she spent 2 months at the Hot Sulphur Springs with her husband and Jack, going around, climbing mountains, exploring the different areas at a time period when that just normally wasn't an acceptable position to put yourself in. And I said more connections, kind of got a little ahead of myself on the last slide, to the Yampa River Valley, why I love to come up here, and to the ties to that. Is there anybody here that's on the Han Peaks Historical Board? I sometimes show this and they get mad at me. But I don't intend it that way. But just about the history and the connection. So Jack Sumner, as I said, moves up to Hans Peak in 1876 because he doesn't like what's going on down on the Front Range. I fully understand that. Housing prices are probably a lot less up there than Denver was in 1876, much like what Fort Collins is becoming Boulder today with housing prices. And so he moves up to Hans Peak, but he brings his wife with him in 1876. And I know we have the sign at the Wither Cabin talking about the first Anglo child born in the area. But Jack's son, Edward C. Sumner, named Carson originally, and then later changed his name to Cody because of Jack's association with Baker and Cody in those areas. And Carson, he was actually born at Hans Peak in 1876, about 25 years prior than the child at the Withers cabin. So making him likely one of the first children born in this part of the country in 1876. And so with that, kind of wraps up my three-act play of different aspects of my research and talk about history and strange little coincidences. I normally close when I'm talking about Powell, talking about the Grand Canyon being a family tradition since 1869. The bottom of Sumner Butte, if you've ever looked down at Phantom Ranch or gone down to Phantom Ranch in the Grand Canyon, Sumner Butte is the butte that's right on the east side of Bright Angel Creek there in the Grand Canyon. But I figured it'd be a little more apropos tonight to call it Colorado, a family tradition since 1859. I guess I'm still talking history and in a way promoting Colorado, so I'm doing much the same, hopefully in a little more moral and ethical way perhaps than Bayard's, but giving you a little more factual history. And so with that, I'd like to thank everybody for your attention, and hopefully you enjoyed tonight. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. And before I forget, also there's some artifacts here that we found in the last few years related to Julesburg. If you're interested, I can talk to you about them afterwards. With that, questions, please.
You're right, thanks. It's great listening to all the history. I've really been interested in the Mill Creek battlefield for a long time. Do you have any suggestions of how we can get that registered as a national battlefield? You know, they still say that there are soldiers.
Yeah,
Let me finish. Okay. It would be a great educational thing because the Buffalo Soldiers relieve the army there. So here you have the three cultures all involved there. How can we do something? And I've talked to people about it, but I can't get that much interest.
Actually, Mill Creek is one of the things that led me into archaeology and seeing what, I'll leave his name out, the person did somebody dug those in the early 2000s, actually dug up in where the battle was at. The soldiers that were, Major Thornburg was the leader of the expedition, was killed in the initial shots at Mill Creek. He was taken back and buried elsewhere where his family wanted later on. But the soldiers and the Teamsters, the civilians that were there, were all buried in a trench with the horses. And a guy dug in the early 2000s, actually located the main trench, published a little book about it, and had pictures of soldiers' skulls and things on the book. It's pretty tasteless. So in that regard, yeah, something needs to be done there. At the time with the war just kicking off in the Middle East, there wasn't a lot of movement to do anything proper with that. It's something I would definitely love to, and I can talk with you more afterwards, work with the landowner and others. To have it designated a national battlefield will take a congressional action. Congress will have to do a special law or get the Colorado congressional delegation to put a rider on a law to designate it as a battlefield, as a national battlefield, because only Congress can do that. I have the same problem at Julesburg. 15 soldiers are killed. Massive battle, critical to later Indian wars. Sand Creek is designated a Civil War battlefield based on a study done in the 80s. Congress directed, passed a law, that's at the Civil War battlefield. The response, more soldiers killed, more important in terms of military engagement. The Native Americans are successful, they're not won. The easiest route to get it recognition would be to have it designated as a national historic landmark. That would give it National Park Service designation, recognition, and being that it's on private land is probably the most viable and would give it, that's probably the best thing to do. The Park Service hates doing those a lot of times. They're pretty hard to get them to the threshold. Well, they'll want to approve them, but because that is the battle that triggers the Northern Utes to be forced out of out of Colorado and put in Utah, it surely should qualify for the significant requirements. So it's a matter of paperwork and working with the landowner to do that.
You're more knowledgeable. You've given us a lot of stuff about the Indian Wars. Isn't this, the Mill Creek battlefield, the last real battle of the Indian Wars? Even though Wounded Knee came like 10 years later, that wasn't a battle, that was more like a massacre or something. But this is the last battle of the Indian Wars, and with our interest in, you know, our indigenous culture and Black Lives Matter, how do we put all that together in this country or in northwest Colorado today?
I'd say, like I said, I'll give you a card afterwards. The biggest thing it'd be to talk to the landowner. Because it is private land, it's essential to have the landowner's consent to do that. I agree. I definitely think something needs to be done. Long term, I would love to do formal archaeology there to locate the remains, have a forensic anthropologist try to put them together and reinter them in individual graves at Mill Creek, and if possible, put, you know, if you could get DNA, you do the research on this. We know which soldiers they are and civilians. You might be able to do with the technology we have now. I actually do remains recovery missions with the Defense Department in France. We're looking for a missing B-17 pilot. We went last year, going back this year. Try to put their names back to their burials, but at least to bury them properly, even if it was back in a more formal mass grave. All that depends on the landowner. One good thing to come out of that, the bad civilian collector work that was done there, it actually triggered a number of changes to Colorado's historic cemetery laws that now make it illegal to go dig not only NAGPRA and Native American graves, but it is illegal to go dig in Euro-American historic abandoned cemeteries as well, so that people can't go and do what he was doing in a grave.
Thanks.
Sure. Any other questions, or am I standing between people and their next beer? Well, if there are not any other questions, I'll hang around and you can ask them after. Thank you.